Welcome to Brave. Be inspired by the best leaders of Southeast Asia tech. Build the future, learn from our past, and stay human in between. I'm Jeremy Au, a VC, founder, and father. Join us for transcripts, analysis, and community at www.jeremyau.com. Hey, Galvin, good to have you on board.
Hi, Jeremy. Yeah, it's really great to be here.
Yeah, so I think what's really interesting is that I'm super excited to bring you on board because you are taking an interesting take on AI, on vision, and on surveillance and protection. And those are really interesting fields because it's going to generate a ton of value for people across the world. And also it's a question of much debate around the world as well. So let's have a chat about that. So for those who don't know you yet, how would you describe your professional journey?
I started as a process consultant. So I graduated from SMU with a degree in quantitative finance. Quantitative finance is kind of like pattern recognition. But at the same time, I didn't really want to be a finance person. I didn't think that it was that interesting to look at the numbers alone. And to be very honest, it was just to get out of my own head. So to be a finance person, you go into your own head. I think I was deep enough in there that I needed to leave. And so what I did was I moved into management consulting. I did that for 7 years in a company that has recently been acquired by PwC before being poached over by a ex-client into DBS. Then I went from process architect into data architecture. I did that for a number of years. I spent a stint in Boston. My wife was in Harvard. I was at MIT. I was hanging out with the system dynamics crowd, which was also people doing pattern recognition in the process world, but really, really geeky versions of them. That's when I got my first taste of the startup world. I was CFO of a small startup doing Uber for X. So 2015, there was many Uber for X startups. All of which are now dead. That was a really good experience in going from zero to raise $6 million and then return all the money within 6 months. And then it was time for me to try something on my own. So in 2017, two things was happening. One was that I had been unceremoniously given a restaurant chain, which was giving me a heck of a culture shock, very different types of people, a very human work that I didn't need to experience when I was working with everybody who was like very highly self-actualized in the consulting and banking world. And then I was doing that and I decided to quit my job in DBS and go full on into my startup. And so I built a startup there called Loretta.io. Loretta.io, it was initially built as a friendly manager that was supposed to help the restaurant staff. Then I realized step one, first thing I learned, the restaurant staff don't need help. B, they won't listen to the system. Third, the data is so complicated that I needed to know what was happening in the building before it made sense what they were doing. And then it reached a point where it simply became the same cost to automate the data for the entire building as it was for my shop. Then I was like, just sell it to the shopping mall. And that's kind of how the business started.
Wow, what a experience that you have there. And what's interesting, of course, is that you've done a bunch of professional career journey as a consultant, both external and internal consulting. What was it like learning to be a consultant at that point of time? Do you think you learned some good stuff from them?
No. So management consulting is the science of synthesizing a very little amount of information into a very large amount of insight. It is the diametric opposite of AI, where you synthesize a large amount of information into a very little amount of insight. And then it is almost luck plus good salesmanship that you get your insight pushed to the client. So I think I learned a lot through it, but at the same time, it was really kind of the upbringing question, right? So demanding parents, but I also have indecisive parents. So I decided to do all of them, right? Do the banking route and the consulting route and the accounting route and the company route, just one after another.
So let's get into that. So you're talking to another management consultant, and you already knew that. So my heart broke. It's like, oh, it's like all the Bain and McKinsey was like, did I not learn anything to be a founder? Don't and I qualified to be an AI leader, right? But that's a very sharp set of words, and I love what you said. I mean, let's dive deeper into that, right? So you said, this is a very little amount of information that you're building into a larger set of insights as consulting. What do you mean by that?
One of the so nearly every top consulting firm in the world right now kind of falls into two categories. One of them are consulting firms that is 80% operations, 20% strategy, and then there's the flip side, which is primarily strategy. The first heuristic you should realize about the high strategy companies is that they are specifically designed to operate on their domain knowledge first before coming in. So let me walk you through a real example of something that would happen. I would go into a very senior client, right? Knowing like 99% of the things they're doing very well, but I can point out the 1%, the blind spot, right? That part of the Johari's window that like you don't know that you don't know. I'll go in there, I'll sit down, and then I will, in a flourish, show this one thing based on this heuristic that I know that they would probably have missed. And then I would look immensely intelligent, knowing full well that in the 99% of the things that they do well, I have much less information than they do. And yet, at that point in time, they would trust me more than that person who has been operating as a project manager in that project for 10 years. And that is sad, but it is really how it works. This is how you do it.
Okay, we gotta go deeper into this one. So suddenly I feel defensive. Like, do I have to defend management consulting and the honor? What I agree with you on is that clients, if they have the capability to consult a management consultant and even consider spending millions of dollars on a project, is they have to be doing something right? They have already created products, an economic engine of getting value from those products and continuing that cycle of production, and they already have a team that's already built out to do that stuff, right? So you're right. I think I agree with you that most companies are 99% their workflow is embedded and ready to go. And we're not fundamentally trying to change that. I do agree with you about the 1% of the things that they don't know, and so they're trying to figure things out. I would make the fun counterclaim, an apologist for management consultants, is that those 1% times are the times when the executive is kind of like trying to make some large capital allocation decisions in terms of structure, restructuring, or market turnaround, capex allocation. And so even though there's 1% of things they don't know, but that 1% of the time is really the times when they really, really need someone to help them. And it could be the difference between, a great decision and a good one, or a good one and a bad one. And I'm not saying the consultants get it right all the time, as people in the industry know as well. But at least it's better to have more heads in the room than less, right? Especially folks who are coming in with a bunch of benchmarks, coming in with a bunch of thought leadership. I'm saying all these buzzwords that I hate myself for saying. But I'll say there's some value in those tough moments. What do you think to that, Galvin?
I guess it's interesting that you say that. So different companies have very different weightages of change versus operate. And with that change, you will find that the taste for consulting sits in a very particular area. So you look through the MNCs, the top, the Fortune 50, Fortune 500, and what you would find is that in the places, you will see that there are kind of three types. There are companies that have no consultants, very, very rare, right? The majority fall into the two smaller types of, they are strong and steady companies that are using consultants to change. And there are companies with very strong core businesses which they are using consultants to support the support functions. So a good example of that is that if you were going to like an Exxon Mobil, you would not consult them on exploratory or explorations. You would ask them to consult you on all explorations, right? But when it comes to things like their finances, their accounting, the way they do their books, there'll definitely be better people out there for it. And so that makes a lot of sense. The other thing that you mentioned, which is things like high capex decisions, is also true, but in my experience, it is 50-50. So this is a point where we can't name names, but there are many jobs that both of us will probably have been in where you know full well that the conclusion of the research that you do would be in favor of the person that brought you in the first place. And it is true. And that support may be needed. And sometimes you need to have a vice president to split the difference in an even Senate, but that's just what needs to be done sometimes, right?
Wow. Okay, we're going there. Wow, we're going there. Well, I would say there are two parts to it, right? One is in order for someone to make the call that you're going to spend a couple $1 million to have a bunch of freelancers or consultants or mercenaries to basically parachute in and kind of like fight a war for you, quite clearly there's a problem, right? I mean, obviously, there's a bunch of peacetime people who are using consultants to think about strategic review, etc. And that makes sense. You're just getting a bunch of academics to help you think about the future. But I think if it's in wartime, the problem is clear, right? And so I think you're also fair to say that if you have the mandate to bring in a couple $1 million and blow that on a bunch of teams to kind of like ride in as cavalry to support, you got to be able to point them at the right direction, right?
Right.
So that, I mean, the CEO and the sponsor team should already have a good sense, like these are the problems, etc. And obviously the high level problem is quite simple, right? It's like, when you brought into the Polish and the Swiss mercenaries on the war, you point them at the enemy, right? And just go that way, right? So the answer is there in that sense, but how that's being executed actually and how that's actually being translated, there's a huge amount of work that actually still needs to happen, right? So
that's fair.
Yeah,
that's fair.
Maybe the answer is we still have to like right size, i.e. do a workforce reduction, i.e. lay off folks. And so, there's a target of 20% for costs, but, it's really difficult, you can imagine, for an established organization to figure out in independent / as impartial as possible with as little claims or bias as possible to run that process in a very fast or even cohesive way, right? So in that case, maybe it's just easier to, hire McKinsey and, ask them to do the hard work of saying, okay, we need a lower cost by 20%, but whose name goes in there is, McKinsey is actually running that process at some level, right?
Yeah. I have an interesting story around this thing that makes a lot of that kind of is pro consulting, right? So it makes sense in this direction. So in this particular project that we were on, there were two mines, there were two coal mines, and they merged. So they had dug close enough that you could take the two housings of the mines and just put it together and have one big housing for the two mines. At that point in time, the obvious question was, where do you cut things? Right? But there's absolutely no reason why either of them needed to be cut. There was no performance impact. None of the numbers can be matched, right? So you cannot compare the numbers of these two mines, right? One has a lot of coal, one has less. You can't change anything. The two biggest things that impact the success of a mine, there's only two values. One of them is the thickness of the coal, and second is the weather that year. So there's nothing you can do about it. And so there was that point where they brought in consultants, and essentially the consultants from day one, they knew that there were like a set of a very large number, like 25 cutting exercises where there is no right answer. And so to a person within the company, there was no right answer. And to a consultant, funnily enough, based on how the organization is built, you kind of have no wrong answer. So long as one is cut, it would have worked out. And so the very dynamic of the large organization forces the consulting role to exist within that field. So there's nothing wrong with that. So obviously it won't disappear, right? It's a question of which parts of it are good and which parts are a bit strange.
Yeah, I totally agree with you about that. I mean, I think that's where it kind of boils down to, right? I think the big difference is that, the strength of the consulting company in relation to the client is the process orientation of the consultant, right? Which is that to a company who's doing a layoff, right, or market turnaround, they hardly do that. Maybe they do that once every economic cycle, right? Once every 5 years, right? Whereas to a consultant, and you zoom in, there's like this partner and his team of consultants, and they specialize in, I hate the phrase, but right-sizing companies, right?
Right-sizing
layoffs, it's like Up in the Air, right? The movie, right? Like they focus on, well, I think that's a bit junior in terms of the movie, in terms of they're actually doing the headcount reduction versus the planning of it. But to someone else, it's like, it's Tuesday for them, right? It's like me and my wedding, right? It's like, for me, the wedding was like the most important day of my life, and I've never done it before. And to my wedding planner, it's like Tuesday, right? It's like just another wedding, right? At the end of the day, I just followed the process that she set up for me, right? And it worked out. So I could have recreated the wedding planning process from scratch, and it probably been cheaper in terms of cash. But it would have been a giant pain in the butt from emotional energy, actually getting married at the end of the day process.
Exactly.
And so I think that's how maybe consulting agencies are like the wedding planners, for companies, right? Like in terms of like the process orientation, right? They're not going to walk you down the hall. They're not going to figure out the ring or the flowers, but they can lay out the stuff, right? And I really agree with you, is like, to some extent, because of that process orientation, the company knows there's a problem and the rough aperture of the solution is there. And then you bring in a consultant to run the process to get to there and actually boil down the level 2 and level 3 answers to actually do that, right? So it's like, okay, we agree with the layoff 20%, but who exactly are the names, what functions to preserve, what functions to cut more deeply. I'm using this very negative example, but it's because it's a question and problem that no company really wants to do, right?
Right.
Everybody wants to do the exercise called, how do we deploy our $1 billion capital bonanza?
Right.
Then you don't need a consultant to, spend $1 billion. But it's quite hard to do the opposite, right? Which is,
Right.
How do we cut $1 billion or more, right? But I do think there's something that you kind of like did, and you had fun contrast was like you contrasted that to being a founder and being in an AI space, right? And you talked about how the process is almost opposite, which is you're looking for deep insights that you're trying to execute on as a founder. So did you feel like that was something I felt like I had to unlearn to some extent? I had to unlearn being process oriented as a consultant and focus on really being results and action oriented as a founder. Did you feel like you had to go through the same transition?
So 100%. So as you become a founder, there are a couple of things that are fundamentally very, very new. And definitely things that I feel are counterintuitive to people who have had longer careers outside of running a startup. I found two things. So one are the type of people and how you work with them are fundamentally different. In a large company, you would not tolerate like a petulant genius, right? But in a startup, you would monetize or you would operate based on that. Or a person who is an incredible salesperson who refuses to talk to anyone else in the office. There are a lot of these in the startup world that are very useful, and they will remain in the startup world, right? So, and these things I found very, very interesting. The other thing I found was that as you build your product, you are constantly in the message building process, which is something I was always learning and something I really, really disliked for a long time. I think if you come from any form of more senior, large company role, you create a crystal clear message at some point. Like, this is what I'm doing, and I'm going to repeat the same message for 18 months. It is in the contract, right? But as a company, it's not like 3 months in, you're like, I'm the best X. And like 2 months later, I'm actually not, but I have pivoted to something slightly similar enough that I don't have to tell all my other clients, right, that I have changed my focus, but different enough that the message for the new clients has to be different. And so like you start to have this very choppy message, which for ages I thought like I'm just a super bad salesperson, like I don't know how to do this. And I realized like, no, this is it. This is how it is.
I mean, I think it's so true, and I think it's such a really good insight, right? Because you're right. Like as a consultant, you had a 3 months project, and then you have your steer codes that you're doing every week or every 2 weeks. There's very like deliberate, zero defect, perfect mini presentations to pre-wire for them, and then you end it off with well-received presentation that everybody already knows in advance, so they're not too scared and spooked by the answer. And then you kind of cascade it down. So there's a very intentional plan, right? It's very like there's a strong cadence, but it's a planned process.
Yeah.
But you're right. As a founder, you're just building a company from step by step, right? And it's a nightmare in that sense to believe that it's like a one-off presentation, it's a one-off message to deliver that makes sense because it doesn't, right? Because you're like 1 month you have 5 clients, and then next month you have 4 clients because you're out fundraising, and then the next month you're up to 6 because you work your ass off and you stop fundraising, and then to close the client back and you want the person back, and then you got another client along the way. So there's some craziness where it's just, was it like, say, like we're building a plane while it's flying? Like that's what they say, right?
The Reid Hoffman, right? Jumping off a cliff and building a plane as you fall.
How do we heighten this analogy more, right? Like Improv style. So it's like jumping off from the space station and building oxygen mask for yourself and the team at the same time.
Yeah.
It's like seeing an asteroid and finding a team of oil miners to drill a nuke into the middle of the asteroid, right?
Exactly. Yeah.
So okay, so there you are. You're making this transition into being a founder. You're learning to be a founder. Tell us a little bit more about why this AI dynamic, right? So you're building out this restaurant, obviously, and then you're taking over the family business. I remember you and I hanging out and talking about how you're suddenly running a fried chicken chain, and
just in front of your office, right? Just in front of your office.
Exactly. Enjoy the fried chicken, I gotta say. And suddenly you're there, and then you're like, okay, AI. So how does that happen?
So there are a couple of things that I've learned about this. So one is that, so first, I think the first and foremost thing that I had to learn was to accept the process, right? So it's not as linear as I wanted it to be, obviously. But beyond that, what essentially happened was, I think the first thing to think about is the question of how process-oriented we are. So I was a true pure play process flow expert. Like there was a portion in time where I would be flown into a place to draw the process flow. Like that is my thing. And so imagine when I ran a restaurant chain, it would open an hour late. The staff had like relationship issues. I had to deal with police investigating officers and gangsters at different points in time, right? Everything, right? And it's a vastly different experience. And yet, throughout that whole time, I initially thought I could build a form of automation or process across the top. And so that's kind of how we started. And then I realized that I'm now in a world where 99% of the things are not measured. It was 5 years after that. So just to give you a bit of a color into that, 5 years after I started that process, that was when there was an open innovation project for identifying the amount of food waste that was provided by IMDA. So that was 5 years later. And that project wasn't resolved. But that's a very, like, all your stock taking is rubbish if people are throwing away your stuff, right? So, like, half of your ERP is wasteful, it's wasted. And then the other half is paper, is physical pen on a receipt. So people give me the receipt, but the receipt is blank and it's just like it's written in pen, the amount of money that they paid. What is the point of that ERP system? So you can see that all of these gaps were in that place. And so I decided to kind of go down into the fundamentals. The fundamentals was, I tried three things. One of them was intensely tracking each of the staff. That was a total failure. As soon as I realized that wasn't working, we turned that off. The second thing I did was we used cameras to capture the information of customers coming in. And then I realized it was a moderate success with a ton of potential. And then the third thing I did at that point in time, in 2013, was that I looked at the staff, and I was still a bright-eyed person who had never run a business in my life. And I decided to give everybody a raise, even though the company was not making any money. And that also worked really well. It worked so well that we were the last F&B shop to close down in Orchard City Ledger. So Orchard City Ledger has a 100% close down rate during that time. Because it had been under renovation for more than a year, we outlasted the entire food court. So first the food court went bankrupt, and then the food court owner themselves went bankrupt too. And it was really bad. But I mean, loyalty was component one that worked out. Tracking people did not work out. Not how many customers there were, but who they were, why they were coming was such an interesting thing that I decided that that's something I can really, really build out. And that's when I began down the AI route. The weird thing about that is that's when it converged with the kind of business that I would have started if I had none of these limitations and things in place, which was to build something that was, because my actual personality is I'm not a huge people person. I am a things and tech person, right? And so when I got into that field with a decent enough mathematical background, I realized that, we can take this really far. We can take this as far as it has been taken very quickly. And so that's kind of what we decided. Okay, that's what I decided. Okay, we can do it this way. And so that's the point where you choose your direction, right? So you choose a direction and then you just run with it.
So there we are, we're kind of like dealing with you. And then since then, you've been successful. You've deployed your systems in camera vision, AI, surveillance and protection in industrials, for military and in commercial. So what has been like kind of like the drivers of your success so far?
I think that's one fundamental thing that has driven our success most of the way. And that is that our business is designed to have the same shape as the evolution of AI. And so what I mean by that is that if you are, for example, a media business, the most important thing for your business is that it scales naturally, because media is always its own bottleneck, right? The more you have, the better it is. If you are, however, an AI business, your business's most important thing is to fulfill the most important gap of AI. The most important gap of AI today, well, in the research world, it will be the TRL 5 to 7 space, which is essentially the working prototype to I will buy this product space. And that particular gap, if you essentially build your platform around that gap, you don't actually need to build the 1, 2, 3, 4 or the 7, 8 gap, right? So that's kind of where we decided to build our stuff. And that has been very successful. So how does that work out in real life? That means that the core AI algorithm that we have has changed from moderately good, like industry standard, all the way up to let's get picked up by the US Army to see whether this is better than what we're having good, right? And the actual interface for the app is the same. Like you can drop it in, like you can go to settings and change it. And so the app can constantly build platform type capabilities and the AI can keep evolving. So maybe 2 years ago, you would ask us like how many people are at X, and you would ask us something like when should you clean the bathroom, and tomorrow or the today you could ask us for this person that placed his bag down on the floor, how likely is it that the person was doing that as a terrorist versus as a tired person? And so the nuance of the question has increased significantly, but the interface is the same interface.
Wow, that's amazing. I think that's really something that's underappreciated, right? Is like the design architecture to allow the known improvements of AI
Yeah.
to be able to come in on a regular basis, because we know the algorithms are getting better and better. We know that the training data is becoming larger and larger in terms of the set size. And we know that there are certain advances that are being, pre-wired to us by the journals, right? And all that
Yeah.
stuff. And I think it's super expensive to re-architecture the whole company every time
Yeah.
one of those things happen versus like, hey, okay, it's a new release. Okay, we just naturally embed that performance improvement into our system and workflow.
Yeah, I think it's actually even more obvious in the AI. Also, we are specifically in the computer vision space, and it's even more obvious in our space because you would be able to predict the longevity of your competitors. So we are in a super red ocean kind of space, right? So that is the one problem with AI today. It is very red ocean, very, very competitive. There are a lot of like for like. That many of the customers are not educated enough to know the difference between a good and a very good product. And so you would know that there are people who are bigger but will fade off at some point. And then they will become, it's a bit of Darwinism in it, right? So when they die, they create food for the masses, right? Because they've all, every one of us does education. So as we educate, we increase the size of the pie, then you die, and then you leave the pie for others. So that's kind of the evolution of the AI space these days.
So, obviously what's been interesting is that, you've also designed, and we've talked about it before, like design your system to also be not only, privacy policy compliant in Singapore and Asia, which is a lower standard, but also be GDPR compliant as well, which is a very interesting dynamic to build for, right? Because when we think of surveillance, obviously surveillance of industrials, surveillance of military purposes is pretty straightforward, but also like in the commercial sense as well. Where there's obviously the privacy dynamics, expectations of consumers.
Yeah.
So how was it like, obviously you had to make a decision to be GDP compliant, and then you had to architect everything to do so. How do you feel about that? Like, because I do know of competitors who have chosen to not be GDPR compliant.
Yeah, I think almost all of our Asian competitors are not GDPR. So the first thing is there is actually a higher standard than GDPR. That we encountered before we ever touched the European space, and that is when we did our first project in Australia. One of the things that you do not do in Australia is you do not impact the rights of workers, because essentially Australia's government is the labor part, is a union, right? So actually we found that to be by far the hardest. So I think this is something that maybe, look, I'm willing to share this, which I think is a very important insight. In the computer vision space, especially when it comes to privacy, if you are the kind of company who doesn't really care about these things, you will truly only stay in Asia, because it's really only Asia right now and South Asia and Africa that has very low privacy laws. So even when we were talking about the US military, privacy came into play because the contractors in the US base are like the wives of the colonel, right? and you cannot facial recognition the wife or the kernel. Like, that is the worst thing you can do. We made this decision right from the beginning from an ethical standpoint. The moment we reached the point where we knew that our technology was meaningfully ahead of the industrial standard, it was time for us to take that narrative and say, if you are the first in the space, you get to kind of carve out what the road looks like, right? And so we made this decision to not save any personally identifiable information. And so by doing that, components like tracking people in a shopping mall became a lot harder than facial recognition. On the other hand, it also meant that we could deploy pretty much anywhere at the same time. So we kind of ended up in both sides. To do that, we had to essentially go to 4 or 5 of our potential clients and tell them that we can't do it if facial recognition is required. So interesting one is that there was one of the Singapore government bodies that was requesting facial recognition on every floor of a building. Any requirement that came out from that particular industry over the next 2 years, we couldn't apply for. Simply because that was one of those minimum requirements. You need to track everyone in the buildings. Once we chose not to do that, then we kind of built that title for ourselves, and it somehow managed to work out, right? We put down, we essentially were able to close one door and open others for ourselves. And it makes a lot of sense. We also decided to take the next step. And the next step after that is to crystallize our point of view into policy. So once you took that stand, then the next thing to do was to talk to people in, for example, the ethics committees in Singapore, and discuss these things, and take the very large gray area that sits on top of like the PDPA in Singapore and kind of turn it into a bit more of a black and white. And so in that way, you get to choose how much privacy we will be giving in the future, right?
Yeah, that's super true, right? And I really respect you for that, right? Because, at the end of the day, choosing to be GDPR compliant is not only obviously a business decision, but also an ethical decision, but also a strategic decision, right? And in this case, like you said, you have to let go of some business as a result in order to do the right thing, the legal thing at a minimum, as well as to, it opens up a whole bunch of opportunities that you couldn't access before, right? And so I think that's where the crux of it is, right? It's like, you're meaningfully better, but not obviously 10x better in terms of performance, but you are 10x better in terms of privacy compliance, and obeying the law of the land, especially in the context of like EU citizens who require their privacy protections on a global basis. But also, I think honestly, that's the trend where the world is going, right? I mean, even China is starting to move towards more regulation of facial recognition technologies rather than less, right? Even though they currently have a head start on that. Yeah. So I think it's really the right call. I think obviously on a personal and ethical level, but also I think the right call from a strategic level. And it must have been one hell of a thing to do from a commercial level, because you had to let go of some clients in order to pursue other ones. What's it like to be part of a field where the policy is still being written, right? And, it still very much relies on the industry to contribute a point of view, right? Because, if you and I were building a startup in, let's just say like stuff that is like a little bit more known, right? Like construction, etc. We're very much abiding with current codes, but trying to figure out efficiencies with it. But when we talk about like crypto, when we're talking about AI and computer vision, when we're talking about drones, very much the policy is still being built. The rules don't even exist, right? So maybe it's like a guideline or industry policy, body policy, which is not the same as law, right? Right. So what is that like? Do you have to do like, how do you think about it?
So the honest truth is that I absolutely love it, right? So a bit of one of the things in my past is when I was in being a data architect in DBS, I was actually tasked towards regulation technology. And so in regulation technology, actually a big part of that is the fact that regulation technology on the surface is very obvious, which is there are laws, we need to do them, connect the do with the law. And in between, the interesting about RegTech is that everything is missing, right? There is no real connection between the law and the person doing it on the ground. And there is this invisible layer of interpretation in the middle. During that time, I found out very early that I could gather the people who interpret the laws, and that unit could sit in the middle like the council of men. So it's like you can actually, you may not be the ones who create the world, nor are you ones who do it, but yet you're able to craft both sides of the narrative, because you allow the people on the ground to see how the law is written, and you allow the people in the ivory tower to see how the law comes out, and you actually control the narrative. As a startup in this space, we're actually very much the same way. There are always guidelines. The guidelines are usually a combination of very strict but fairly antiquated laws, but also a combination of the sentiment on the ground. Any of us know, and Jeremy, I know that you spend a fair bit of time doing polling as a bit of a side job. You know that the sentiment on the ground is very, very inconsistently communicated up, right? And so it is the way that a poll is written creates the outcome that you see at the top of it, even though the sentiment on the ground is the same. Likewise, as a startup in this space, the way that you write your narrative allows you to change the sentiment on the ground. So I give you an example. In Singapore, more than half of the country prefers their privacy to their operations. It's one of the lowest in the world. It's like 60% prefers their privacy versus more services. But if you communicate this in the same way, like, oh, we are the Google Analytics of the physical world, then you're like, oh, I've given you my privacy in the online world, I can do the same thing in the physical world. They are actually very, very different, because in the online world, it is contained within a particular area. Lazada does not wash cars, right? So it's very specific. But in the physical world, everything you do in between is far more indicative of who you are than what you do at the point of execution. And so if you take that narrative, you actually continue to allow people to take more, to give out more of their privacy inadvertently without them knowing. If you however take the other route of these are the things I am not capturing, then people will immediately realize like, oh, so everybody else is capturing that. And then the narrative becomes very different. And so by doing that, you actually get to guide the narrative into the future. And you can also play the strategic card that way, right? Because you can essentially take the hidden values, right? Like the Brave browser of the world, right? That you can take the hidden benefit that people are monetizing, and you convert that into your unique selling point.
That was really interesting, right? Because I think you said two things that were pretty much can be underappreciated, right? Which is, one is that privacy in a digital domain is what most people think about privacy. And people are currently extending the same metaphor for privacy in the physical domain, right? And what you're saying is actually the privacy in the physical domain is way more valuable than privacy in the digital domain, because, you know, I'm going to Lazada to buy more cat food, right? Versus like in a private world, you're actually, you know, getting a very deep profile on what the person is doing. So that's both the value of the physical data, but also the value to the business, but also the value to the consumer, right? In terms of privacy. And I think the second thing that you're talking about that's pretty true is when you talk about, you know, controlling the narrative, you're not necessarily controlling the narrative to destroy privacy. You're trying to control the narrative and craft it so that you can preserve more privacy. So a little bit more like Robin Hood than the sheriff, I guess, in this example. I guess the tricky part, of course, that's here is, okay, you know, you're building out this computer vision, you're building this out in the GDPR compliant way. Does it feel like a bit unfair that all these like Asian tech firms that, you know, and I'm aware of a few of them as well, it's just like sucking up data and they don't give a shit about compliance with GDPR, and assume that there are no EU citizens in in the field of vision somehow, and be able as a result to sell a stronger commercial case to the shopping malls, to the security cameras outside homes and public spaces. Do you feel it's unfair?
I used to think it was unfair, but I realized that a big part of that is the inconsistency of my own mental model, right? So here's a bit of a guilty thing that I can share, but I think this is true for most B2B startups. Very often when you're pitching to the client something, you haven't built it yet. You know that guy is going to take so long to sign the contract. By the time the contract begins, it will be there. Even if it's 6 months later, which in a lifetime of a startup is like 17 sprints or something like that, right? So it's like, yeah, it'll be there by the time you sign the contract. The way that I think about things, like the way that these companies work today, is I think we have now reached the point of understanding of AI to know that you don't need to do that. That is far more likely that companies that rely on personal data will find that a handicap in the future. And I think we are now at a point where it is starting to be clear that that's not working out. So in a way, I feel vindicated, right? Because we didn't really know that from the beginning, but we decided it's worth taking an ethical standpoint. But now it's actually, it is coming up exactly like that. So a simple one is this, right? So a tracking, the system that we use so we do tracking. So let me just lay it out there. So we do track a person in a shopping mall. But we never use your face as a face identifier, right? And so because of that, two things happens. One open secret in the software world is that your biometric data is an actual line of code, right? Which means that I could copy and paste your facial recognition from one camera, paste it to another one, and it will still recognize you. Like, it is actually a key to your identity that you cannot change, right? That's pretty frightening. But what we're doing is that we take everything about you, including your clothing and your outfit, and then we track that as your entity. And so that person can be tracked for the next 24 hours. And then at the end of the 24 hours, two things will happen. One is that we will deliberately delete that information. And second, that information is meaningless anyway because you'll probably change your clothes. You better change your clothes. So,
You think too highly of me.
I'm not talking about you, Jeremy. Not into another black shirt also. But essentially, so these two things will happen, right? And we thought like, okay, this was hard and it was not nearly as accurate initially. But two things immediately became obvious once we started to do it and implement it. One is that we can actually track you from the back of your head, which then goes to the second point, which that because we work on CCTV cameras and facial recognition actually has an optimal degree of 30 degrees up and down for your face. This non-PII, non-personally identifiable information method works very well on CCTV cameras, and facial recognition actually doesn't at all. And so it was emergent in a way that worked out for us.
Wow, that's amazing that you were able to switch your approach, but also serendipitously discover that actually the approach does actually give you performance advantages for different use cases, which is amazing. And so Galvin, coming up to the end of the show here, but could you share with us a time when you were brave? Tell us of a time when you had a challenge or obstacle that you had to overcome and be brave.
So that's interesting. Let me tell you a recent story. We had two members of our team who were both very valuable to the team. And the relationship between them became complicated, right? So that was something that was interesting. It became complicated in both ways. So it became very close and then not so close. And somehow it reached a point where one of them was accusing another one of something serious enough that the police got called in. This happened not that long ago, not that long ago, right? So, one of the things that we had to do at that moment or one of the things that I felt that I had to do at that moment was to find a way for both people to feel heard, even when it was very clear that we were about to move into a point where one or both of them would leave the company and it will end very badly. In doing that experience, I really spent a lot of time. Essentially, 2 or 3 weeks of the company just became black, and then we essentially found out what's going on there. And during that time, we actually rebuilt the trust of every individual with each of these individuals, because once this process begins, the process of distrust spreads within the company, right? So both of them obviously don't trust each other, but then everybody else questions their relationship with these two people as well. And so that creates a very complicated dynamic. And eventually we reached a point where they actually both managed to resolve their differences. It never fully resolved. Eventually one left, one remained. It cleared out. But actually we're still all on talking terms. That involved amazing things. I can't really talk about too much, but we were in the interrogation room. So I remember we had a conversation about interrogation rooms recently. And I was in fact in one of them also like a couple of months ago to solve this police case. But yeah, during that time, I think the most important thing to realize is that there are 3 routes to take. So one of them is there is a publicly right route that matches with things like democratic mentalities and like LGBT, that kind of thing. So that's one component of that. There is a business route, and then there's a route that takes the human element first. And sometimes if you take the human element, usually when you take the human element, whether you get the first 2 results is completely a black box. Like you have no idea because you give the control back to them. Like, okay, you get to communicate, you get to say whatever you want. But if you are lucky, and if the environment is right, everything works out.
Wow, that's a tough one. I can totally see how that would have been a tough situation. And thanks for being so open to share about how you manage that process. And I think to wrap things up, thank you so much for coming on the show. I really appreciated 3 parts that were really good. I think the first part, of course, was you opening up with saying that management consulting has no value, and that shaping up to actually becoming some level of consensus about which situations a consultant is helpful and which situations a consultant is less helpful. And this, of course, is brought to you by 2 former consultants. And then the second thing, of course, is thanks for sharing, obviously, your experience in building a company and thinking through the dynamics about what it means to build AI and found a business from scratch. And the third, of course, was your deep thinking about the industry practices and really being a champion for privacy and GDPR in comparison to the industry. So I'm really kind of hats off to you for helping protect us everyday citizens as we go about in our normal days, right?
Yeah, the battle continues for sure.
Well, thank you, Galvin, for fighting the good fight for us.
Yeah, no, thank you for having me. It was really fun.
Thank you for listening to Brave. If you enjoyed this podcast, please share this episode with friends and colleagues. Sign up at www.jeremyau.com to discuss this episode with other community members in our forum. Stay well and stay brave.